The Black Death. To hate something to death, a fate worse than death, to be on death row at risk of the death penalty, to observe the death rate, to be in the death throes, or to be at death's door. And while in common media, whether we're watching action films or playing video games, this death concept is most often passive and without much reflection. This passivity can be felt when mentioning terms that would otherwise blanket the outright existential death feeling, such as a nation's military budget, or the systemic malnutrition, or the agricultural or meat production of a nation, utilizing the death of various plants, of various animals to achieve the sustenance of a nation. These deaths are passive in the way that they are not felt and they are not acknowledged. And this is not a call to action. This is a call to reflection. In this specific session, the question is, how have we thought of death? How has the idea of death changed throughout time? And this is a huge subject, especially when just even relegating it to mythic and spiritual traditions. But as we'll find, you cannot speak on death without also defining life. And this subject matter tends to encompass aspects of the afterlife or belief in spirits or ghosts. And I believe to the casual listener that there is much more to learn in this investigation than one might otherwise assume. To clarify, this is not necessarily a history of funeral rites or a history of concepts of the afterlife. This is a kind of smorgasbord of association, of approaching a different way of thinking in regards to the subject of death. And to start chipping away at the stone of this modern mentality, we should first mention the cyclical concept of life and death. This Ouroboros, or this reoccursion, regardless of if we are to say something like reincarnation, the ancients saw this replacement of that which has fallen. New life springs up from where that older life died. And so this cyclical nature was an original reverence or an original concept towards. And if we look at the more universal mentality given by the Native Americans, then we could split the experience of living into 4 conditions. There is birth, there is life, there is death, and there is afterlife. These 4 wrap back into each other. Often there will be stories, say from grandmother, that speak on the original instructions, the codes of conduct, the laws and responsibilities that living beings have with the world that they inhabit. Each being that is born is thought to have a part in this collective responsibility. Each is given a spirit, each is given a name, and each is given a grouping, whether this is species or this is a clan. Each is given a talent or a destiny or a gift that will help them meet and overcome the challenges of said given talent or destiny. This is not uniquely human. This applies to all forms of life. And in this case, we see that this approach offers something different than the modern approach. And that is because this approach understands where it's coming from. It understands its purpose because it knows where it's coming from and in what direction it's moving towards. Accordingly, once an individual has died, that end-of-life ceremony acknowledges this person's accomplishments, yes, and their downfalls, yes, and also how that plays into the group of people of which they are aligned. This group of people, this tribe or this nation, understands that this person speaks of their people. And so their accomplishments are not only their own, they're also reflections on how we people, what our society peoples. And their downfalls are also lessons for us to learn upon the ceremony of their death. Otherwise, trouble could be afoot if we cannot put this to rest. But as a somewhat universal modality of the spiritual composition of a person, there is the spirit, there is the mind or soul, depending, and the body. And in the Indigenous philosophy, there are many that would say that the spirit leaves and goes back to the creator or goes back to the spirit world, that area, that realm that gave those initial talents, gave that initial destiny. It could be said that the spirit enters the body of the child when they are born. That first breath is the intake of spirit, literally. Respiration, spiritus, that first breath is when the spirit comes in to inhabit. And that child will go through 4 stages of life: childhood, youth, adulthood, and the elder years, depending. The child's role is to honestly get lost at some point for a while and to return to self and to seek self, to know thyself. This self-actualization is married to the finding of the creator and the celebrating of the creator, to bring one's gifts into service of all of life and all of humankind by extension. This initial responsibility, purpose given by the grandmother or given by the creator is unnegotiably the felt conscious experience and innate responsibility of beingness. We experience failure. We have to confront our weaknesses, our cynicisms, our cruelty. We have to go through a degree of training depending on the nations that we inhabit. We have to embrace a healing of ourself and a healing of that which is outside of ourself, which is ultimately ourselves. And this is the responsibility. Ultimately, if destiny allows it, then in our adulthood and in our elder years, this training, this healing, this lesson learning is passed on in the most effective ways that it can be, given our culture, given our nation. But this person who lived, who has now died, was a person, was a conscious, wielding person. And so when others come together to offer them their ceremony, their funeral rite, we have to acknowledge this person. And in this way, help them to leave this physical world and move on, let go, and move back to that place of which they originally came from. This grieving that comes from this is a grieving from both ends. The grieving of this person having to let go of their life, and the grieving of the community having to let go of this person. And this is especially challenging if something tragic came about to bring about this one's end. This grieving, though, is essential and requires great nuance and great consideration. But at this death, the body is thought to go back to where it was gifted from. It goes back to the mother, to the earth. This body was given by the mother, and this body is reclaimed by the mother. This body was facilitated by the gifts consistently given, the food, the animals, the plants. These gifts consistently providing this body, and it is returned. It was effectively continuously on lease. And in the same respect, the breath, the spirit, the inhabiting consciousness, personhood, is returned from where it was taken, or from where it was, more accurately, provided from. This mysterious, mystic, ineffable place of origin. And regardless of any modern indoctrinations in the ancient world, or even still yet in this contemporaneous world, to see someone pass away, the spirit is so obviously felt leaving the body. And if it's leaving, then it's going somewhere. Some would be there to say that it travels westward, it travels across the lands, over the river, into the mountains, and ascends into the clouds. And this is that ascendancy towards the heavens. This is a joining of the ancestors, regardless of if we give it a place or not. The ancestors substantiate all of life. Everything that has been done by living people. They are not here anymore, but the very framework of which we build off of, the very canvas that we enter upon being born, was all the ancestors. So they join the ancestors, but only through the allowance of death, only through the completion of grief is the spirit allowed, or allows itself to return. This is helped by the funeral, whether these are prayers or songs or medicines that are offered during the ritual, or this acknowledgement, this aforementioned acknowledgement and grieving process, all to help the person let go and feel complete, a completeness about all that they just experienced here. If this grieving cycle has not been completed, then the person wounded from this death will carry it on in life. And this is the criticism of the Egyptian afterlife, for instance, how the heart is weighed on the scales, and if the heart is heavier than a feather, that person will suffer. This heavy-heartedness is the holding of grief. And that is as poisonous for the one who just passed as it is to those that are still yet living. And sometimes the ceremony or the funeral cannot be conducted, or this full completeness cannot be solicited at that time. There needs to be more time. And so the culture creates a ceremony to help acknowledge this greater function, to clean up the loose ends, or to continuously acknowledge this recursion and this need for letting go and this need to acknowledge. And this could take the form of the ghost dance. And no wonder the annual ceremony takes place in the fall after all the leaves are off the trees. This celebration of the ancestors, of which each one of us would become. And as with the 4 stages of life previously mentioned, there are 4 nights of dancing and 4 nights of fasting. In any such ceremony, you call in the directions, you call the ancestors to co-participate in the ceremony. You offer tobacco, you offer foods, you offer thanks and prayers, that they are remembered, that they are honored, and that they are respected for all that they provided. It does not go unseen. This sort of ceremony additionally provides the podium, or the means, facilitates teachings from the elders, teachings from the adults to pass on to those yet to learn. And if we are to consider life a dichotomy, that the upper world is this benevolence and this lower world is this evil, then that means it is all the more important to negotiate between these different dichotomies, to keep this balance. And provided that we are in the middle of these 2 worlds, that the composition of ourselves is between these polarities, the spirit must undergo the trials and tribulations and experiences of both. By word of the Haudenosaunee, when a person dies, their spirit is taken by the faceless one. This is the beginning of their journey. From here, the spirit takes a number of days to reacquaint, to get centered in this new plane of being, or in this grieving that is necessary, and ultimately will be moved skyward to be taken on a path that is the Milky Way. This Milky Way leads to the House of Souls. This House of Souls is where we came from and where we return to. This concept of the sky world giving destiny would have long legs throughout mankind's history. If we are to look at the Mesopotamians, looking at the stars for omens to know when they should build that temple, or when there is that star in the east that the Zoroastrians, the Magi are following. All of this destiny provided by astrology, the significance of the solar system's cyclical function, and also the constellations further into the exterior. All of it bringing down the order, the destiny, the responsibility, the framework for what we are doing here. But let's take in a different kind of context. Let's look at the Lapita people, who are the ancestors of the Polynesians. Through archaeological observation, there are a number of ceramics designs of stone structures that we could call tikis. These tikis symbolize the relationship between the present material existence and the present sky existence, the body and the spirit. But for the Polynesians at large, when the spirit leaves the body upon death and enters the afterlife, this afterlife is the opposite of the current world. When something decays in our world, it blooms in the other world. It is the opposite, where everything unspoiled becomes spoiled, and so forth. When we die here, we are born there. It is a reflection of everything that disappears from this world appears in the other. So in their case, the belongings of the individual are removed before their burial. But if we reflect, even when we are living in this world, we still have a subconscious. We still dream, and we still affect other worlds by the felt experience of the individual. So thus, ghosts, after passing, still possessed power in this world. We're thought to influence the weather. We're thought to influence the decisions of living people, and especially would be strongly hosted in certain locations, in old trees, or on certain roads, or in mythic caves. So it's essential, therefore, to have a relationship with these passive spirits that are present. And it is of the interest to the culture to develop ways of communicating or understanding the interests of these inhabiting spirits. And this also was a gift that could be given to the living. The specific ability, the talent, the proclivity to communicate with the dead. This can be thought of as an impetus, one explanation for the presence of shamanism in the ancient world. This talent to reach these inhabiting spirits through dreams or through hypnagogic states, to offer them prayers or food or even blood, provided certain rituals to placate and keep the balance, keep the peace of this world. In the case of Polynesia, this is ancestor worship. These different rituals and customs that are involved in everyday affairs in acknowledging the dead. The ancestors are not this burdensome presence of the world. They provide guidance. They provide rituals and knowledge to help facilitate life in this world. They offer protection from harm, provided that they are placated, that they are acknowledged, that they are respected, and their presence is known. We might take another perspective by looking at the Maori and their goddess of death. Her name in translation means the Maid of Dawn. And while there are fascinating tales for how death originates, especially in this tradition, we can instead look at a quote from one story, and it says, "Return and raise our offspring in the world of the living. Leave me here to draw our offspring down below." This to us corroborates our former investigation of the afterlife being a reflection of this world. Raise them above, and I will draw them below. And this is the great woman of night, a loving mother of both those from the upper world's offspring, welcoming them into the paradise of the lower world. But of course, we dread the process of death. And so the death deity also comes with representations of dread. This night can be fearsome. She swallows mankind and gives birth to them in the other world. This transitory, liminal experience through the Mother of Night. This reflects heavily across the board of mythical traditions. Immediately, Hecate is a great parallel, or maybe Persephone would be an even greater Greek parallel. Here in Maori mythology, there are a number of motifs that we will see throughout. For instance, there being a guardian at the gates of the underworld. This death's door reference. In the case of the Celts, this is Dormarth, which is a dog at the gates of the underworld. As we acknowledged earlier, there is the belief of where the soul travels to upon death, and this is Cape Reina to the Maori, this most extreme northwestern point of New Zealand. Coincidentally, the Celtic believed that the souls of the deceased moved to the northwestern direction. To them, this would be the Brittany coast. In both cases, this is where the sun would sink beneath the earth, not just setting in the west, but where it would start to rise in the underworld. This is the direction that the souls move towards. Thus, the colloquial saying upon a funeral that this person has gone west. If we look at Egyptian practices, we'd see that towns tended to be on the eastern side of the Nile, and the burial sites would be on the western bank. Thus, the mummies would be ferried westward across the river towards their resting place in the west. And this other trope that we're introducing here is that there tends to be a river in that movement towards the underworld when it comes to mythology. And so for Greek mythology, you have Chiron, or the ferryman that takes the new dead across the river Styx to the gates. Yet again, we find a similar case for the Maori, this concept of crossing the beach of twilight sands and then crossing the water of lamentation. In that translation, coincidentally, if we translate the Greek river Coctus in Hades, that also is the river of lamentation. And so here we're starting to introduce a rather elaborate concept of the realm of which the dead go towards. Reserving conversation on the Greeks for later, we can instead look at Xibalba. Xibalba is the 9th level of the underworld to the Mayans. In order to reach this part of the afterlife, one has to move through several dangerous trials, crossing rivers and waters and high mountains, obsidian knives spinning, arrows flying through the air, even the sacrificing of one's own heart would be necessitated to reach this level. Since the ancient Mayans believed that the afterlife was truly an arduous and testing task, they would often be given useful pieces of equipment or food or even animals. And here we have a case of giving dogs to those who died, whether these dogs were literally sacrificed and buried with the people, or figurines of the dogs were placed in graves. And here we can see the answer to the trope. Why Cerberus is at the gate, why Dormarth for the Celtic people was at the gate. This is a trope that unifies the world's mythology, the dog in the afterlife. the dog as a guide to the afterlife, the dog having an innate sense for these places, for the spiritual, this attunement that would be of great service to those feeling their way through the dark in their transitioning into the next life. And another synchronicity that we have to come to bear with is that the Milky Way is the entrance to Xibalba, the road along which all souls meet their fate. In the active iconography of Xibalba, there was believed to be 9 different levels to this afterlife experience. And so the pyramids, the stone pyramids that were built, are 9 levels. And the mythology of this journey and the mythology of the afterlife and underworld for the Mayans is truly elaborate and would deserve its own spiritual study session. Moving quickly, we can say that there are a number of deities ascribed to the underworld, all of which have a role in the trials and tests of the soul to gain admittance, initiation, to continue their journey on further. If a soul, if a person needs to reach a state of universality, needs to become one with this spiritual world, there will be much in the way of baggage to be released of, to grow and develop through. And these deities play the role of a kind of Baba Yaga or a initiator each step along the way, preparing the self for arrival at that manifested place. So here we see that the act of dying is in preparation for a long role to play in the afterlife of a further becoming. And so the people living in the world will make rituals, will give gifts, and do anything that they can to help this person, this departed soul, in whatever way that they can find to assist this transition between the afterlife and the world yet to come. But if we instead transition to Sumeria, then we can further validate some of the tropes that we've already been seeing. For instance, we have Erishkigal, the lady of the vast place, the queen of the great below, or the queen of the dead. Does this not conjure our earlier Maori reference? This lady of the great place is more accurately described as the lady of the vast place because Urkala, or the underworld, is truly vast in the same way as the many levels to arrive to Xibalba was for the Mayans. This also bears the name that we'd see throughout mythology on this given subject, which it is the land of no return. Once you pass through those gates, there is no return. It is a one-way ticket. But much like the Mayans, this Urkala was certainly not a nice venture to be going through. They said that the souls of the dead drink muddy waters and eat dust. This willingness to defy death is greatly illustrated by the Epic of Gilgamesh. The ancient Mesopotamians also believed that this nether world was the cosmic opposite of the heavens, this shadowy version of life. Metaphysically speaking, it was thought to be a great distance away from the realm of the living, but in another sense, it can be immediately observed or is just below the horizon line of the earth. You can even say that the thought of the trope zombie comes from how the dead are described once they meet a new dead that arrive in the gates. They rejoice and feast upon the newly initiated one, that the dead hunger for blood, that they hunger for animacy, for agency in the world. And this uniquely comes out of this very bleak thought of what the afterlife holds. The Mesopotamians did not believe in metempsychosis. They did not believe in the transmigration of souls. They had no concept of a resurrection or of a reincarnation. Mortality was the very definition of the human experience. That is what made them unique to the gods. Though here in Mesopotamia, we see another motif as we've seen it before, and this is a euphemism for dying, which is to go to one's fate. This quest for immortality proves futile because it is a denial for one's fate. Humanity could only continue to exist through metaphorical means, through influence of the world and not of what would happen thereafter. This definition of aliveness to the Mesopotamians was the air moving through the body and the blood moving through the body. At the point of which the blood and the air no longer was within the body, this was officially considered dead. This association with life and blood also speaks to the supernatural trope of the vampire, thirsting for blood because it is dead. Blood is its way of mimicking or approaching genuine aliveness. This overall philosophy of this body being made from clay and returning to clay is echoed in the Bible, where we have, quote, "You are dust, and to dust you shall return." But this isn't necessarily the end of the spirit for the Mesopotamians. Although physical death has occurred, the spirit continues. This divine aspect that was put into the clay continues. This temu, of which we could translate as intelligence or understanding or consciousness, is immortal and will move on into this underworld experience well beyond the body. But it is not alone in its travels. There is also the awilu, which is the dreaming self, the best way of translating. The dreaming self that moves in and out of a person while they're alive in the dreaming experience. That dreaming you is not always in your body. It comes and goes. And so in death, that dreaming you continues to visit the consciousness as it is in the underworld. But this journey to the Urkala was also arduous, as it's been painted elsewhere, and needed the assistance of a ferryman across a river. And even upon reaching the underworld, this judgment that would ensue on that given soul would not necessarily be based on the merits of the life that they had lived. It was a bureaucratic decision what would be done with them. That fate that is unknown beyond your life, or just the fickleness of the deities in charge. But even upon reaching their decided station in the underworld, they still had influence on the living world. This could be done through that mentioned dreaming self that still moves back and forth wherever it pleases. The souls of the underworld are not having a good time, so whatever they can do to be given offers from that which is above, they will commit towards. And as long as they are given something, as long as they are pacified in some sort of way, then those spirits can remain at peace. But if they are not pacified, if they are not given ceremony, then there will be harm to come on the living. But again, let's back this up. We don't have to think of this purely as spirits and the way that it's contextualized through the modern mind. If grief is not dealt with, if you do not honor the will of, say, your grandmother and what she wanted from your life, if you don't live up to that standard in your mind, that takes you over. If you're lesser, it takes you over. And so to not honor the wishes of the dead, to not honor the genuine values that were inherited by you, that will be a grief that lives inside you, or in other words, a restless, vicious demon. The demons of Mesopotamia would enter through people's ears. They would haunt the dreams of the living. If you had done wrong by somebody or had a hand mistakenly, even mistakenly, in their death, they would plague you. You see, this is grief. This is trauma. Anyhow, to return to the schema that we've been illustrating. Now we'll talk about the Greeks and Hades. And here we have that mention of all the rivers from before. And this is not just Styx. This is the Acheron and the Pyrothedathon and the Cactus. Each of these have a unique function in soliciting a misery from that which is above, whether that is their direct portal into the underworld after being put on the pyre, or if that is just simply a river of misery. So why is all this so miserable? While there are many interpretations to give, we can point to two things readily. We can point to the inherited ideas from the civilizations that came to inspire these civilizations. But more poignantly speaking, what would it take to remove the burdens of the living on the souls within the afterlife? And what I mean is, what makes you change as a person? Clearly, it's not being comfortable. Being comfortable doesn't change you. It doesn't make you alter the way that you are. Hardship, desperation makes you willing to change, makes you willing to shed something. And if the schema, as it originally was for this afterlife experience, was to strip yourself of the burdens of life, to ultimately become something that could move into the spiritual realm of which you originated, then suffering would be necessary in order to actually make you change. So then we have probably the most curious river, which is Lethe, which we saw played a very crucial role in the mythology of Orphism. But here, this river of forgetfulness comes at a very distinct point in the underworld Hades experience. After you have gone through those trials and tribulations of misery and so forth, achieving desperation, then you drink of the water of forgetfulness. You leave it behind. And this is a purification in a certain interpretation. This would be hopefully necessary. If you're going to move on, you have to let go of the baggage. You have to be willing to forget it. But this isn't the last river to mention. The last is Oceanus, and this is the river that encircles the world. This is the ocean. This is the boundary, thought to be the boundary between the land of the living and the land of the dead. Again, the underworld is underneath the horizon line. It is a reflection of this world. So the ocean, to a Mediterranean culture, would certainly be that boundary between. But we have a few curious aspects to go over, most notably the ferryman, and this reoccurring custom that moves into the Roman era, which is to leave coins on the eyes of the dead. These coins would be to pay the ferryman, and if you didn't have the coin to pay the ferryman, then you could be left on the shores, denied entry even into the gates of Hades to begin your journey before it even started. Not receiving the proper burial was hugely taboo. Not receiving the coins would be an absolutely disrespectful thing to do to somebody, or to remove those coins from the body would be an absolutely disrespectful thing to do. This would be outright disrespecting the dead. And the dead, especially in Greek mythology, have plenty of spirits that are on the ready to make you pay for doing such a disrespectful act. This could be the Uranus, or this could be Nemesis. And so these gods, in a certain sense of the word, of the underworld were on the ready to make you pay to affect the living world actively if somebody didn't do right by the dead. And again, I'm pointing to the original idea of grief and of doing right by each other. But there's a curious concept in this Greek Hades that the dead person is stuck in their age, that time is a temporal pocket when it comes to Hades. If you were to go to Hades, spend years there, and then return, no time would have passed. So when it comes to visitations of ghosts, they are always the same age that they were or had been. They are not older than they were when they died. And this is explaining that trope. This temporal pocket is that person who died, is the one going through the initiation of the afterlife experience. Not an older version of themselves, but that very same aged person. But overall, aside from the concept of the Elysian fields, the experience of the afterlife was stripped of this initiatory belief. The overall function was to live a insubstantial life that could be capable of interacting with the world of the living, but would be careless about it, because life in Hades would overall be a blank, bleak slate. You could be married, you could play games with others, but nobody would age and nothing would substantially happen. So it would more be resemblant of a purgatory, most often at least, again, if we're neglecting the mention of the Elysian fields. The overall status quo would believe that the dead would be in a state of undevelopment. They would chronically be just as they were. And this forgetfulness that would become of them would mean that they could arrive into the experience of the afterlife with gifts, but not know how they received them. And this ties us to something much older. And what I mean is, you arrive in this life with certain talents, just like we were saying at the beginning. Maybe you have luck. Maybe you were born into wealth. These things were gifts put on your grave in the other life. You showed up here, you didn't know how you received them, you forgot. But they were given to you. And then some people are born and they don't have these gifts and they aren't, affluent. They're given a rough job. And so then the gifts were not put in the grave of the former life, you see. But when it comes to the more active Greek practices, these rituals that would be in honor of the dead, you can see in the Odyssey that blood sacrifices are essential for animation of the dead. If you wish for guidance, or if you wish to conjure them in regards to prophecy, so forth, then blood, the essence of life, would be needed to gain their interest or to call them forward. Most often, animals were used during this particular process of conjuring the dead. So although the status quo generally believes in this very bleak Hades perception, there are still clues in the mythology that hint to what the idea was before all this bleakness was put on top of it. And that hint is Persephone. When we were talking about the Polynesians, we talked about how what was Spoiling in this world becomes the fruit of the other. Persephone is the goddess of harvest. The tale of Persephone moving into the underworld is the tale of how that which is spoiled from above is provided to those from below. When the fields stop growing here, they start growing there. This is an ancient hint at what was. This condition of Persephone of living sometimes here and sometimes down there was the condition of this harvest, this personification of this harvest as it is here and as it is there, above and below. But as a quick list of the deities that give us hints at this overall conception, we have Hecate, the goddess of magic, magic as it is associated with spirits and spirituality. You have the Uranies, which are goddesses of vengeance. And again, if you do wrong by those that you cared about, do wrong by your ancestors, by your grandmother, whoever, there is vengeance, there is karma in the world that is unnegotiable. You have Chiron, this psychopampos that helps bring you into the experience of the dead. And you have Cerberus, the dog, which, as we saw before, was playing the role of guiding the soul through the experience of the afterlife. But we can also talk about the dog's role in protecting property, and this role of a dog being at the cemetery, protecting the cemetery, protecting the burial sites so that nobody could interfere and dishonor the dead. These are allegories, people. These are allegories. To round out the list, we have Thanatos, which is the direct personification of death. That's on the nose. We also have Hypnos down here, which is the personification of sleep, and that's on the nose. And there are a few others to mention, but the one that I find really curious is an exception, which is Hermes, because Hermes, as the messenger, can move back and forth between the realms. Hermes at times acts as a psychopampos, helps to guide the spirit through the experience of the afterlife. So in this way, messages travel universally. Communication can come from anywhere. So the prophecies given through spirits, through dreams, what have you, this Hermes is playing the role as the aforementioned dreaming self of the Mesopotamian mythology. So with some headcanon, we can see that the presence of ghosts in the world for the Greeks would have been by virtue of Hermes. And when it comes to the Greek idea of ghosts, it was said that you could only see them in places lit by a torch. And this has everything to do with shadows, the shadows of the light. If you are in the woods and you light a fire and you see the shadows of all the trees all around you, this is ghastly. Shadows have a lot to do with the idea of afterlife, soul. Thus, we have the shades of the Jewish conception. But to the Greeks, ghosts aren't necessarily evil. You do the mourning rituals, you provide the funeral and the feasts honoring the dead in order to pacify these evil spirits, these evil thoughts, however we want to talk about them. But the good spirits would be those that could come into your dreams, and they could offer you advice or offer you care or offer you affection from those that you have lost. But by the time we reach the Middle Ages in Europe, this has almost completely been stripped away. By the time Christianity has reached its height of institutionalization, there already was a lack of good spiritual presence. The ghost or the spirits inhabiting would be malevolent, would be demonic, and often you would have to say, in the name of Jesus Christ, in order to discern whether this was a good or bad spirit. But as we know, that goes to the exorcising of the bad spirit, being that it cannot handle the name of the Holy One. But regardless of the mentality of Christianity, reports from the Middle Ages show us that at times ghosts can be this insubstantial mist, or they can be fully physical forms, fully physical bodies that you can literally touch. But ghosts tended to be male, and they tended to be pale and sad and in rags. They were not lively and distinguished when they would choose to appear. Ghosts always embody the previous era. A critique of modern ghost hunting is that they always tend to be Victorian, or they tend to be like from the 1920s. But in the Middle Ages, they would see ghosts as knights or people fighting battles passively. So this appearance of an apparition can almost be thought of as a kind of temporal bleeding from the previous era into the modern era. If there are thin places, there might just be visions or shadows of what has happened that is experienced in the modern time. But as time moves forward, it's always what was last, if that makes sense. We're not going to see an apparition from 500 years ago necessarily. We're going to continuously see it from 50 to 100 years ago, just as an example, and just as some head spinning, as time moves forward, that threshold also moves forward. But regardless, in the Middle Ages, the kind of proof or place for spirits was that they were in Purgatory, this temporary plane between heaven and hell. This pocket dimension, yet again, is retained. So depending on the explanation, this purgatory can come to bear. So at this point, we can see how really shambled this is at this juncture of history. We have purgatory sometimes, for those that ascribe to it within the denominations, as this intermediary that decides where they go for eternity. Whereas in previous modalities of thinking about the afterlife, there was a journey to go on, but it would result in joining the spirit world. The ancient conception was more along the lines of the universalist denomination of Christianity, the belief that everybody deserves salvation. But stitching this into the modern day, we can see how all of this really falls apart. Even in colonial times, a funeral would be the ceremony, which was a solemn affair, right? The burying of the body, and everybody looks sad. And then there was the wake, which happened after, the large feast, and the biggest cost of this whole occasion would be the liquor, the rum that would be drank to deal and cope with this death. And we can start to see this fixation on the body. A great instance of this would be the death of Lincoln as a means to test out the new science of embalming, to use the faculties of human innovation to do everything in its power to preserve the form of the body, to the point where they take Lincoln on a 2-week trip across the nation for people to observe his lifelike appearance. This fixation on the form of the body being retained is unfounded in regards to the history of dealing or thinking about death. The concern would be placed on the soul of that individual, on the moving consciousness of that person, and of dealing with the grief therein, instead of any fixation on what exactly to do with the body, minus a few exceptions. We could talk about the Tibetan sky burials versus the Tibetan water or earth burials. However, this fixation is truly of the modern era. not to mention its commercialization in how much a funeral costs and how much the casket costs, and how this has all been commodified as it is this focusing around the body when it is conventionally done, at least. But there still are these remnants of this ancient tradition that was once had. We have the case of Halloween as this very trivial kind of nod to all this. That is the Day of the Dead. Especially in the United States, this is almost completely devoid of anything of its original meaning. A much better and more direct nod is the Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead, that still is performing the ceremony as it was in the ancient world. You could see it as one and the same. You first have the individual funeral, that which honors the passing of that consciousness. However, grief is not so often done all at once. It is not so often satiated, or the individuals dealing with said grief might not be ready or in a place to handle such. So you have this collective day that everybody, in an act of solidarity, honors, mourns the ancestors, or additionally reconsiders that grief that they'd experienced both this last year and in the years prior. So why does it look like it looks like today in the more or less hegemony of Western practice and approach? Of course, there are a myriad of factors coming together to answer this. There is the emboldening of science as it's been throughout the last few centuries, which provides a neurosis, a allergic reaction to uncertainty. In addition, you have this assumed compulsion towards comfortability, everything towards comfort, convenience. And death is suffering, or is challenging at the very least. It is transformative. It is sacrificial. And these pains that come along, whether it's another individual passing or whether it's yourself, the pains of that change are not thought as something to be utilized, are not thought to be something to gain wisdom from or a greater appreciation of life from necessarily. It is more thought of as something to ignore and something to neglect in any way possible. Thus why the rum bill was so expensive at the Puritan funerals. As opposed to this original conception of the cyclical nature of human existence and existence at large, we can instead think of death as a fluke, as something that just ought not be, but we just have to kind of ignore in its anomalous happenstance. In a society that has nothing good to say about where it's coming from, it certainly would have nothing good to say about what it's moving toward. This kind of an approach is a detriment to mankind. It alienates those that are experiencing grief for their lost one. There is no greater recognition of this individual experience. There is no accommodation in culture for this mourning. Any kind of cathartic process that helps validate and deal with this mourning is trivialized. Spiritual hogwash. Anything that might honor the dead is overshadowed by the bleakness of the modern world. But let's keep it simple and let's talk about it more plainly. Although we can elucidate all the variations of approach towards the afterlife and funeral rites by the wisdom of our ancestors, we can just simply say that this is a reality, and that this is transformative. This death aspect of life is sobering and is powerful, and a vessel towards dealing with or towards facing this reality of life is positive. And our hyper individuality in the modern world has cut us off from each other and from those who have passed. And there is a debt that comes with this hyper alienation that we're collectively moving further and further into. And this overall critique within this reflection is our willingness to connect, our willingness to cross these bridges and to build ties and to become a part of will be a medicine for our toxifying time. Life is intimate and fleeting. Our protection of our emotions and our psyche closes us off from living, and thus it closes us off from dying. To embrace the heartbreak, to let it happen, and to soak in to those fleeting moments as they are available. And there's only so much we can grab. But it's something as simple as saying, I'll see you on the other side. The Spiritual Studies program does not take in any ad revenue through YouTube. If you see any ads throughout any of the spiritual studies sessions, know that this is to the financial benefit of YouTube alone. The Spiritual Studies course only takes in patronage through a Buy Me Coffee page listed in the description box below. If you want to support free public education on spirituality, religion, and mythology, consider a one-time donation or becoming a member. Any finances provided help incentivize a continuation of the course, help buy resources for research, and help fund equipment for this kind of process. that the reality of what it takes to do this on this medium. Thank you for listening out this long. Till next time.